What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my least favorite CRPGs. As a channel that focuses a lot on CRPGs and has played a ton of them, I would venture a guess probably more than like 95% of people, it's a safe bet that I'm a pretty big fan of the genre as a whole. However, in having played so many, there have certainly been a few that I wasn't wild about. And while I think it's important to note that in many cases I wouldn't consider these games bad outside of maybe 1 or 2 of them, these are definitely the ones that I would consider my least favorites. That said, I've reviewed all but one of these, so if you want my full thoughts on them, by all means do check out the review, as those videos aim to be a bit more objective than this one is seeking to. But with all of that said, let's actually dive into this and start talking about some of these. First up, we have Lionheart: Legacy of the Crusader, a game with a really interesting premise that unfortunately was sort of dead on arrival. You see, Lionheart had the unfortunate position of being one of the last games published by Black Isle Studios right before it shut its doors, and essentially it was rush out the game with what they could or just never see it released, and they chose the former. Meaning that Lionheart plays very differently at the beginning of the game than the end of it, which is quite literally unfinished. But the game itself is an alternative history title that is set during the Crusades, roughly 1588, and during an event with a previous crusade known as the Disjunction, magic entered our world from other dimensions. So this game sort of mashes up historical figures with more traditional fantasy elements, and it even uses Fallout's special system as a base. And while Lionheart had a lot of good ideas, and the beginning of the game is actually even pretty good when you're running around Barcelona, the game shortly thereafter devolves into a series of dungeon crawls with next to no RPG elements at that point, essentially becoming a weird version of Diablo, at which point the game becomes a bit of a mess. And for that reason, Lionheart is on my list of least favorites, even though it did have some really cool ideas. It unfortunately just never got the chance to shine due to factors far beyond just this title. Which is not an entirely dissimilar case for Beyond Divinity, the second Divinity title. Chronologically speaking, this one actually only takes place roughly 6 years before Divinity Original Sin 2, and covers the escape of Damien from the hell plane of Nemesis. And Beyond Divinity is another interesting one because if you follow the channel a lot, I love Divinity lore. I've covered it an insane amount. And from a lore perspective, Beyond Divinity is a really important game. It sets up a lot of things that we wouldn't get to see otherwise. But unfortunately, it didn't quite stand the test of time that Divine Divinity did, its predecessor. You see, Beyond Divinity is more of a linear dungeon crawl itself with a lot of development issues. Larian Studios was really struggling at the time this game was made, which caused a lot of cuts. The game has horrible difficulty spikes where it expects you to actually go to these battlefields, I think it calls them, which have nothing to do with the rest of the game. They're just there to give you enough experience, and it's essentially just a map filled with monsters because it didn't have enough content for the main game to fix these weird difficulty spikes that popped up, which is just one of many bizarre little problems that game has that makes it exceptionally difficult to play. Which means it's not one I would recommend much of anyone play. If anything, I'd actually tell you to go watch my story video on this one, because playing this one is difficult. And that's from somebody who loves the Divinity universe. So, unfortunately, that's why it's on this list. Third up on our list, though, we have Shadowrun Returns, a bit more of a recent one. However, I wouldn't consider Shadowrun Returns a bad game by any means. It's simply that there isn't a lot to it. You see, Shadowrun Returns is a very small title. It'll take you maybe 7 to 10 hours to play through the entire thing, which for a CRPG is no time at all. Which means a lot of what you do in that game in terms of its tactical combat is very limited. It's weighted just by its very nature to a couple different classes available to you, which makes it a very unbalanced, I would say, experience. And while I really enjoy the world of Shadowrun, and I really appreciate Shadowrun Returns for leading us to the much better games of Dragonfall and Hong Kong, Shadowrun Returns has always been a little too basic for my taste. Now, I will say it's actually actually a pretty decent entry point into the genre for other people just because of its very small in scope nature. But beyond that, I would say that the game feels like more of a tech demo than a full-blown CRPG. It feels like a side quest in a bigger game, which has led to me being less than fond of it, to be honest. For our fourth spot, though, we have Torment, Tides of Numenera. Of all the games on this list, I would actually say this one is my pick for best of the least favorites. I liked a lot of what Torment was trying to do. It was billed as a spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, as I'm sure many people know, and Torment is set on a world that is basically just Earth, but about 1 billion years in the future, where many worlds, as they call them, or civilizations, have come and gone in that time period, which means that the entire world is just littered with the detritus of these past civilizations, with there being tech everywhere that almost no one understands completely. And that, combined with the story's narrative around the changing god, a man who sheds bodies who then become their own people when he leaves them, is really interesting. Unfortunately, the game is a very much so more narrative adventure. There's only about, I would say, 10-ish encounters in the entire game. And even in those encounters, there's not a lot of combat to be had, which makes making a combat-oriented character actually pretty difficult. There are fights you are not really meant to win. So even though they present that as an option, it's just not really, which means a lot of the RPG elements are weighted towards the things that are going to allow you to talk and interact with the world rather than actually participate in combat, which only comes up a handful of times. Which means that the pacing and the content itself can just have a way of feeling really off. And while I enjoyed parts of what Torment had to offer, compared to Planescape, the story doesn't quite hold my attention as much, even if it is still pretty good. So ultimately, Torment is on this list because it is trying to do a lot of things, some of which just didn't really land for me personally. That, however, brings us to our final entry with Atom RPG, a Fallout clone that sets us in a post-apocalyptic USSR, and for an indie CRPG, I think they did a pretty good job, but that nonetheless doesn't really change the fact that the game is filled with an exceptional amount of jank, a lot of things that don't just quite work right. There's many ways to break a variety of quests, and while you can't really ever break the main quest, it's very easy to leave yourself with kind of no idea what or where you're supposed to be going. And I would also say the combat and the build variety, things like that, are woefully imbalanced, which isn't a huge deal in a single-player game, but it is to the point where it feels like you will be punished for playing the game a certain way, as some options are just leaps and bounds ahead of everything else. Like there's a sniper build that is ridiculous. And while the game has something to offer you if you're just a really big fan of Fallout clones, say you want to play something like Fallout 1 or 2, for instance, and if you're willing to get past the jank, the game even has some interesting things to explore out in the world, interesting events, all sorts of side quests, and interesting things to see. But for me, the frustrations, I would say, outweighed the more positive aspects of the game, of which there were some, which is why it is on this list. That said, that is pretty much everything I've got for you guys. There have been 5 CRPGs that I wasn't particularly fond of, which is why they're on my least favorite list. Though that said, as someone who loves CRPGs, even these I still kind of liked, though obviously to varying degrees. That said, I'd love to hear about some games you love, in spite of their problems, in addition to any of your own least favorites. But again, that's all for me today, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.